Hello, everyone. My name is Rosa Dene David, and I'm very excited to be here with you. I would also like to thank you for staying at home and practicing social distancing. I'm a professor at Universidad de la Sabana in Bogota, Colombia, and today I will be talking to you about teaching strategies to optimize accessibility and inclusivity for students with learning disabilities. In today's workshop, we will be learning about inclusive teaching practices. It is important to remember that inclusive teaching refers to practices that support meaningful and accessible learning for all students. The strategies I will cover in this workshop aim to recognize the strengths that both students and teachers bring to the classroom. We will explore 5 core teaching practices that promote inclusive, equitable, and accessible teaching. It is important to recognize that not all learners acquire language in the same way, and not all learners are able to demonstrate learning in the same ways. I want you to take a moment and look at this image. I want you to think, what do I see? At the bottom of this image, you will see a quote from Albert Einstein that states, "Everyone is a genius. But if you judge a fish and its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid." I want you to sit with that quote for a moment and think about what it means within our educational context. The same can be applied to the entire educational system that we as teachers lead. Would a PE teacher ask a student in a wheelchair to run a 5K? I would assume not. The same should be applied to a student with a diagnosed or undiagnosed learning difference. We need to make not only accommodations, but modifications to our curriculum to ensure that everyone not only has the right to learn, but can demonstrate their learning through ways that are meaningful to them. When we look at educational opportunities from this point of view, we now move from creating equality in the classroom to creating equitable classroom learning experiences. This image shows us what equity looks like within our classroom. On the left, we see an image where everyone is given the same constraints and it hinders 2 individuals from being able to participate. On the right, we see what happens when each person is addressed by his or her needs. Look at this shift. By thinking about the individual learner and our teaching practices and the way that students are able to demonstrate their learning, we now see that all students will have access to classroom materials, and moreover, they will have the ability to demonstrate what they have learned and what they know. It is important to understand that at least 10% of our learners have some kind of learning difference. These learning differences may not be diagnosed or disclosed. For the purpose of this presentation, we should recognize that though some students may have diagnosed learning differences, others may have never been diagnosed or may choose not to self-disclose. As teachers, this is extremely important because we need to take the stance that everyone has the right to learn, and regardless of their educational background or the information that they provide to us, that we should make accommodations within our teaching practice to ensure that all of our learners have access to classroom instruction and that all of our learners can demonstrate what they have learned in a safe and supportive environment. Some of the most common learning differences are these 6. You will see that some students may have issues learning to add, subtract, multiply, and divide. Other students may have issues with learning how to read or the acquisition of literacy skills. Others may have issues with coordination of movements. There are some students who may have issues producing or reproducing language and sounds within the language. We also have learners who have a hard time staying in one place for a long time, and others who may have issues within their social interactions. However, these are only 6 areas, and remember that there is such a thing as co-occurrence, meaning that 70% of students may have more than one of these underlying difficulties when learning. Now, let's take a moment and talk about why we should implement inclusive teaching practices into our classroom design. Take a moment and look at this slide. This is just a small list of reasons why we should differentiate our instruction, and by no means covers all of the reasons why we should seek to be inclusive teaching practitioners. Some of the areas that I find the most interesting is that we need to find avenues to connect with our learners and to help our learners connect with classroom materials so that they can demonstrate their learning and that these areas are relevant to their interests. We also need to think about how we can ensure that different learning styles are incorporated within our classroom instruction so that we're actually thinking about learners' abilities and their academic backgrounds. Now, again, this is not a complete list, but these are 4 points that you should think about when you reflect on why you should become an inclusive teaching practitioner. Let's look at 5 strategies that we can incorporate to create a more inclusive classroom environment that upholds equitable practice and ensures that all learners have the right to learn and that all learners are receiving instruction that it supports their different ways of acquiring and demonstrating learning. The 5 practices that we will focus on are designing your course and its materials with inclusivity and accessibility in mind, maximizing the varied educational backgrounds and personal experiences of each student and their lived experience, creating a respectful and productive learning environment to promote cooperative learning and student autonomy, thinking about potential areas that may be challenging for our language learners, and finally, assessing inclusive teaching and reflecting on teaching practices to support our own professional growth. So let's start by talking about designing your course and its materials with inclusivity and accessibility in mind. Generally speaking, as educators, we should always seek to include principles from universal design for learning. 2 of my dear colleagues are presenting on ways to implement a UDL approach to teaching, and I hope that you will choose to watch their presentation. I'm not going to spend a lot of time discussing what UDL is, but on the most basic level, Universal Design for Learning seeks to ensure that classroom materials are accessible for all learners. It also seeks to ensure that assignments give students choice in the ways that they demonstrate their learning. Instruction should promote student autonomy and agency in the classroom so that students will have buy-in when thinking about what they want to study to motivate them. And finally, materials should promote flexibility and also should be designed to give them more than one avenue to acquire information. When we think about teaching in these ways, we are able to ensure that a larger number of our students are able to not only demonstrate what they have learned, but to have access to classroom materials in ways that are meaningful to them. Now, this might be a funny analogy, but I really want you to take a moment and think about ordering a pizza with a group of your friends or with some of your family members. I can tell you from my own experience that this is oftentimes challenging, and let me explain to you why. My favorite kind of pizza is pepperoni. I just like cheese and pepperoni, and that's it. Meanwhile, my boyfriend, he loves all of the toppings. He thinks that pepperoni is boring, so the more toppings, the better. And my mother, she prefers veggie pizza. I also have a dear friend who loves pineapple and Canadian bacon. And for me, I think that is disgusting. Now, when you think about ordering pizza with a large group of people who have different tastes and different ideas about what is delicious, we see that there may be some problems. I want you to take a moment and think about how this reflects learning in general. We all have different learning styles and different ways of accessing information and thinking about information. Some of us think we're visual learners, while others may think that they're auditorial learners. So, from this perspective, we need to remember that we need to give our students choice. Choice in the ways that they receive information and choice in the ways that they demonstrate their learning. Now, I know I've said this numerous times throughout this presentation, but it's one of the key components of being an inclusive practitioner. So let's take a few moments and reflect on assignments and how we can ensure that students have choice in their learning. A clear example of this is a speaking assignment, right? As teachers, we have to assess students and how they speak, thinking about fluency and accuracy and language and production. Now, it's a lot for us to take in, and oftentimes we ask students to do a skit or to act something out in front of the whole class. Now, some students might really enjoy this, but others might find this terrifying or overwhelming. So, how can we differentiate a speaking assessment? Well, there's many ways to do this. Here are just 4 examples. We can tell students that they will have the opportunity to give a poster presentation in class, or if they don't want to give a poster presentation, they can create a podcast or a video presentation. They can interview people on these presentations and their creativity can come out. There are some students are going to feel more comfortable giving a presentation with a group of their classmates, a group of their peers. And again, they can do it in front of the class. They can do it one-on-one with the teacher or in a small group, not generally one-on-one, but in a small group in front of the teacher. Or they can do this within a video presentation. All of these students will still have demonstrated their ability to speak. However, what is different here is the mode in which they have chosen. Hence, this truly demonstrates what choice looks like in an assessment context. Now let's talk about our second principle, which is maximizing the varied educational backgrounds and personal experiences of each student and their lived experience. Now, it's really important that we get to know our students from day one and not just what their favorite color is or what their favorite TV show is, but really get to know them. We need to think about what they've already learned and what interests them. We need to ask them what areas that they really like within their language education and also ask them what is challenging or difficult for them. We should let them tell us ways that they learn. So for instance, I love watching videos. It helps me connect to course content, especially with reading. And we need to do this throughout the whole semester or the whole school year, depending on what area you teach in, so that our students are constantly in contact with us and sharing with us these areas in which they thrive and also areas in which they need additional support. It is truly important to create spaces where students can share who they are and what strengths they have and what challenges they may face, both academically and personally. One teacher in the United States named Kyle Schwartz started a movement that many teachers have now incorporated into their practice. She wrote a book entitled, I Wish My Teacher Knew. Schwartz has given students a voice within their learning by simply passing out sticky notes or index cards. And she asks students to simply write down things that her students may wish that she knew about them. Here you can see some of the comments the students have shared. For instance, one student has said that she doesn't have friends to play with. Another has described a learning difference that she has that makes it difficult for her to acquire information. All of these stories help the teacher understand not only the demographics of the class, but the ways in which he or she can improve their teaching practice so that everyone, again, has the ability to learn. The third area we will explore today is creating a respectful and productive learning environment to promote cooperative learning and also student autonomy. When we think about creating a respectful and productive learning environment, we should think about providing clear expectations for our learners so that they have access to information in an accessible way. We also need to show students how they can find ways to incorporate or receive additional support. We need to establish classroom rules for interactions that are kind and compassionate. And we also need to think about how we can plan ahead and prepare for difficult moments while maintaining an honest dialogue. Now, this point is very important to me because difficult situations always arise in a classroom, whether it has to do with topics or curriculum that have multiple perspectives or students being unkind to one another. These areas are important and have value. And we as educators need to really think about how we're going to respond to this notion of creating a respectful and productive learning environment. One of the most important things we can do is simply facilitate collaboration and collaboration between students who may not always feel comfortable working with others. We need to create an environment where students know that they can work together, whether it's in a group or in a pair, and that we can debate and be respectful at the same time. So we can have different perspectives and different understandings, but we can still do this in ways that show empathy and kindness. In doing so, the teacher is truly creating an opportunity to informally assess students, give feedback, provide additional support while learning more about their learners. Now, this is one of my favorite examples, and the reason why is we need to connect with information in more than one way. We always talk about Krashen's I+1, right? How can students negotiate meaning and share information? However, we also know that students need to learn how to work together and access information in more than one way, going back to universal design for learning. Now, oftentimes, we don't think about how we can connect more than one learning pathway together. Here's a beautiful example of this. Students can read an audio book and listen to a recording at the same time of the same audiobook. They can also use text-to-speech software, or if we're really talking about cooperative learning, students can peer read to one another. Let's move on to our fourth principle, which is thinking about how potential areas might be challenging for our learners and how we can address these before these areas become overwhelming. So we know that some of our learners may have issues acquiring language. Now, these issues happen both on a linguistic level and just in general terms of learning. Some of the problems that they may have is segmenting words into phonological units or recognizing a word. Some of our learners may have difficulty with their reading speed or spelling because remember, English is not phonetic. They may also rely on a smaller range of vocabulary and that these words are difficult to retrieve, so they may pause when they're speaking to grab these words out of their memory bank. They might also speak slower, and they might have issues keeping the verbal material that they're trying to produce in their long-term phonological memory, meaning that they may forget what they're trying to say as they're saying it because of how they're chunking information. Other issues that they also may have are related to non-linguistic areas, such as they might have a smaller span of working memory. They might also have issues taking notes and with handwriting and keeping up with taking notes. This also could cause issues with time management and organizing their ideas onto paper or onto a computer. And this also may create issues developing these new skills that they're learning in their language classrooms. We need to think about how we can help students develop learning awareness by combining 4 senses to the curriculum. Teachers should help learners develop auditory, visual, tactile, and kinesthetic learning awareness in the language classroom. Now, what does this mean? This simply means incorporating activities that include at least one of these elements into the classroom activity. The teacher can play a video with subtitles in their first language, not only their second language or additional language. Why? Because this will provide students with the opportunity to really understand what they're hearing and to connect what they're hearing with what they're reading. In a previous slide, you also saw an example of a student reading and listening to the audiobook. This is a great example of how a student can read along and understand the context in more than one way. We can also think about using sandboxes in our classroom to create tactile learning. If you put sand into a box and you have students use their forefinger to write the word and practice spelling in the word, they can feel it in a way that you can't necessarily feel it when you're writing with a pen or a pencil. You can also think about using realia as a way for students to feel and touch objects in the classroom. If you find this intriguing and you like this idea of language learning awareness, I strongly recommend that you look at the work of multimodal teaching. It will help you develop further techniques to bring in these 4 senses. And finally, we're going to talk about inclusive teaching and reflecting on practices to support our own professional growth. So what does this look like? As teachers, we should ask ourselves or think about the following statements, such as, are there patterns in students' learning that indicate a need to make changes to classroom materials or the curriculum? Are my students succeeding or having difficulty in relation to specific course content? We can also think about who we are as educators and address some of the implicit bias or stereotypes that we experience as learners and as teachers. Because remember, we are also always learning about our own practice. We can also keep a journal and take notes about our classroom observations and the way we're teaching. And doing this will make a difference for all of our learners. An example or two of this is keeping a teacher journal or using Post-it notes to keep track of classroom interactions. Now, what do I mean? Okay, look, I know we're all very busy, and keeping a teaching journal may not be the best way we can spend our time. However, I think we can all carry Post-it notes in our bags. If you carry Post-it notes, you can simply write down what you're thinking and post them or stick them into your book. I do this for all of my classes. For instance, when I can tell that my students haven't acquired something or that the content didn't quite make sense, and I know that I'm going to need to readdress it in my classroom, I simply write on a sticky note and post it in the book. Because guess what? Otherwise, I may forget. So keeping track of these little things by simply carrying sticky notes helps me organize my ideas for my learners so that I can ensure I repeat things that students need to review, and also so that I can know what I was successful in teaching and what I need to review. If we, as educators, are able to take small steps towards creating inclusive teaching practice, then we can meet the objective stated in this Chinese proverb that says, "Tell me and I'll forget. Show me and I may remember. Involve me and I'll understand." I hope that this presentation and the information that I have scaffolded in this presentation will be useful for you and will inspire you to keep inclusivity and accessibility in mind. Thank you. And here are some references for you if you would like some further reading on these topics. Thank you again, and feel free to email me.